stern, sleeping on a cushion. The disciples woke him and said to him, "Teacher, don't you care if we drown?" And he got up and rebuked the wind and said to the waves, "Quiet, be still." And then the wind died down, and it was completely calm. He said to his disciples, "Why are you so afraid? Do you still have no faith?" And they were terrified and asked each other, "Who is this? Who is this? Even the wind and the waves obey him." This is the reading of the word of the Lord.
Thanks be to God.
Amen. I'm aware in our society, particularly today, that we seem to be surrounded by fear. Fear is something that is indigenous to the human species. It seems to be part of who we are. It's built in there for some good things, that fight or flight issue, but it's also something that causes us a great deal of angst, anxiety, and just plain discomfort. And I can't think of a time when we have been surrounded by more fear than perhaps we are now. And perhaps a lot of that is due to the communication resources that we have. We have everything from Twitter to other types of communication resources that just seem to inundate us with all kinds of information. And most of it tends to be negative. We know, for instance, the suicide rates have gone up in various groups of people in our society and indeed globally. So there are indications that there's a great deal of anxiety, and at the base of that there is a great deal of fear. And so this particular passage, one of the reasons I wanted to preach on this passage is because it talks about the concept of fear and what it means to have real fear in the midst of having Jesus in the boat. So we have this little vignette. And this wonderful thing about Mark is one of these disciples who is strictly by the facts. His gospel is very brief, and he gets to the point. He doesn't philosophize a whole lot, and he's not too much of a theologian. He tries to present things as he recalls them. And so we have this story about Jesus wanting to go to the other side of the lake. Now we realize that anytime he was in a public setting, that he was inundated by people who wanted to talk to him and wanted to touch him and wanted to interact with him and wanted to be healed by him. And so he developed a reputation at that point, and so he was exhausted at this point, and he told his disciples, "Come, let us get into the boat and let us go to the other side of the lake." And so the disciples, many of whom were fishermen, of course. Okay. So it was towards the evening of the day, and they took off and left several boats with them. And as they were going, he took a nap in the back, and they ran into a storm. Now, the interesting thing is when you read this passage, you realize that these are fishermen that are used to this lake. Now, that particular lake, the Sea of Galilee, is a fairly shallow lake. And if any of you have ever been sailing on a shallow lake and a storm comes up, you realize that on a shallow lake, what happens is the winds will actually pick up the waves because there's not a whole lot of depth there, and those waves can become very fierce. And so what would normally be a squall on the ocean can be a very threatening storm on a small body of water. And so here they are in the middle of the night, in the middle of this lake, in a storm. all these seasoned fishermen become very anxious about what's going on. In fact, they start fearing for their lives because the water is rushing over the gunwales of the boat, and they begin to see that they are sinking. And yet Jesus is in the stern, pleasantly sleeping away, apparently oblivious to whatever is going on with them. And so finally, they wake him up, and they say, "Don't you see that we're perishing?" And Jesus, of course, took care of things, rebuked the wind, everything stopped, and everything was calm. Now, the interesting thing is that in this story, the fishermen, his disciples, were very anxious and very nervous and terrified during the storm. But after Jesus calmed the storm, what was interesting is that Mark says, and they were terrified of him. And they said, "Who is this that can calm the storm? That even the storms listen to who he is." And so we realized that the disciples were still on a pretty steep learning curve in trying to really fathom who Jesus was. But the remarkable thing about this story is that it does talk about the whole issue of being fearful, being anxious, even in the midst of Jesus and the boat. And it speaks to us in terms of where we are in our own lives, because many of us deal with a great deal of fear and anxiety. I just went through some surgery a month ago. I had a fusion in my back. And the problem that I ran into was not the surgery itself, but it had to do with drug reactions from the drugs that they gave me that I'd never had before. And so I got into a downward spiral with all of these drugs they were giving me, to the point where I was beginning to wonder whether I was even going to survive. Okay? And so I understand, I've been in that place before, and I understand what it means to be fearful and to be anxious and to be worried about something when you feel like you're on a downward spiral and nothing is going to make any difference. So there's a couple of things that I have come to realization, I guess, at this late point in my life, and that is that one of the things that I realize is life is more full of storms than it is of calm waters. The plain fact of the matter is that life is more full of storms than it is calm waters. We are deluded when we think that life should be an oasis. The fact is, we are in storms most of the time. And that becomes a reality that we have to accept. The second thing I want to say about that is that fear can capture us and can overpower us. And it can control us up to the point where we live in a constant state of fear. Fear can just take over our lives and simply dominate who we are, and it will dominate all of the decisions that we make. So we have a tendency to go into this fearful spiral that takes us down, 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 down. And that's when things get very serious. When people feel hopeless, helpless, and in a downward spiral, overcome by fear. The third thing about that is when we are fearful, when we are full of angst and full of a great deal of fear, we in fact find it very difficult to trust anyone or anything. So when somebody says, well, trust in God when you're fearful, that's a very difficult thing to understand for a lot of people. Because a lot of people think God is this ethereal creature somewhere that has very little to do with us. And so we feel somewhat abandoned and alone. And fear can do that. Fear separates us. Fear, in fact, makes us distrustful. Fear, in fact, reinforces those kinds of feelings in us. And the fourth thing that fear can do is it can make us continue to make really bad choices. You know, when you're fearful about something, it's amazing how many stupid decisions you make. And they just continue to compound on one another because you make a stupid decision and then you feel like you have to justify that stupid decision with another stupid decision, and therefore. So you get on this roller coaster of fear that takes you farther and farther away from health, farther and farther away from those people you love, and farther away from God. Well, the issue has to do with, so what do we do with all that? You know, what do we do with all of this stuff associated with fear? Well, it seems to me that looking at my own life and reflecting on it, the first thing we need to do is we need to admit to what it is. You know, most of the time when we are afraid of something, we don't really talk about what it is we're afraid of. We have something else that we kind of use as a smoke screen because we're afraid to admit to someone that I'm afraid of something. I'm 68 years old. I'm supposed to have it all figured out. I'm not supposed to be afraid of anything. But the point is, part of becoming healthy and in the relationship with God is to admit what's really going on. What you're really afraid of, and being able to admit that to yourself is the first step. This is what I'm afraid of. This is what scares me. This is what I'm terrified of. This is what I think is really happening here. And I need to be able to admit that so that I can move to the next step. The second thing is that admit that it can control our lives. And so we have to make choices from that standpoint. In other words, if we are afraid of something, we need to understand how that fear is preventing us from living a full and healthy life. And we need to understand how not admitting that continues to hold us captive in a way that binds our spirits and, in fact, affects our health and makes us even more unhealthy. The third thing that we need to do is we need to realize that fear prevents us from trusting. Fear prevents us from trusting other people, and it prevents us from trusting God. The basis of faith is trust. We have to have that leap of faith, which is trust. We have to be able to believe that God loves us, God cares for us, and God will make a difference in our lives. And the fourth thing that we need to do is we need to reach out and ask for help. Now, I have to tell you, folks, I've been a pastor for 43 years and a business person almost that long. And it has taken me an awful long time to realize the importance of asking for help. Because we all think that we are supposed to have it all together. We get to be better actors the older we get. But you know something? All of us have pain in our lives. All of us are hurting in our lives. All of us need to be able to admit that to someone and to be able to trust enough to say that that person can make a difference, that God can make a difference. And when I say to reach out with someone, that's the basis of the church, folks. The basis of the church is a hospital. It's not a country club. It is a hospital. It is full of people who are hurting, who are suffering, and who are fearful. And the way that we get through those storms is because we have seatmates in the boat who are people who have gone through many of the same storms that we are encountering. That is the fabric of the church. That is the backbone of the church. It is made up of people who understand suffering, but also understand God's grace in the midst of the storm. So, if you are in a point of suffering and hurting and fearful, and you reach out to someone and say, I am hurting and I need some help, that gives that other person the opportunity to bridge into your life. It gives you the opportunity to realize that that is the basis of profound Christian love, because that is the way that God works in our lives. God is not something that is removed from us. God is within us. And therefore, when we have the opportunity to reach out and ask for help, then that person has the opportunity to reach to us and to touch us and to help us become whole again. And that's a very, very powerful message, because it means that all of us are equipped by God to be able to do that. Every miserable experience we've had in life, every challenge that we've had in life, every bad relationship that we've had in life, everything that we have gone through in life that has been a struggle can be a blessing if we see it that way. And if we are aware that people in our midst are hurting, or people who are afraid, or people who feel estranged, or people who feel outside the camp, and we know that God is speaking through us, then we will reach out. Despite the storms of our own lives, we will in fact reach out. And in reaching out, that's where we become Christ-like in our behaviors. Because God calls us in the midst of the storms. You know, the oases are great times, but it's the storms of life that really make the difference. You know, a word that is not used too much in our society anymore is a word called character. And character is formed through going through the difficulties of life and having the ability to learn through those challenges. And the way it happens for Christians is by reaching out and sharing and learning from each other. So, that means that when you have the opportunity and realize that somebody's in trouble, because you're made aware of that, God is saying to you, you need to do something about that. You know, when we have announcements, talk about somebody in the hospital, talk about a family that's in a difficult situation. When those kind of announcements are made, it's not just throwing it out there and hoping that some of it will stick. It's saying, here's an opportunity. God's saying, if that tuning fork within you is ringing, that means you need to do something about it. God is calling you because God has prepared you for that. You know, I remember when I was an executive, one of our senior members of our company, her twin sister was involved in a freak accident. And she was at a point of death where they were going to pull the plug. Well, her vice president, the guy she reported to, came to me and said, I guess I need to go to the hospital. Would you go with me? And I remember going to the hospital with David, and we were right outside the room. And we knew what was going to happen in that room, and he looked at me and he said, Craig, I've never done anything like this before, and I don't know how to respond. I don't know what to say. And I could look at his face, and I could see the fear and the anxiety in his face. And I looked at him and I said, David, you don't have to say anything. All you have to do is be there. That's what I'm talking about. Is that in the midst of the storm, sometimes all we have to do is be there. You know, I have realized that one of the reasons I enjoy coming back to churches that I have served is because I see the faces of people that I love. And I'm not the normal interim who can go in and out and just simply close the door on people and say, well, that was then. I've never been able to do that because I care very deeply about people and their journeys. And one of the things that I think about this church, and I think about some of the saints who are no longer with us, and I think about the saints who are in the pews this morning. And I want to share with you as an encouragement in the midst of the storm. A simple little poem that was written by Frank Whitney. It's called, I Behold the Christ in You. I behold the Christ in you. Here the life of God I see. I can see a great peace too. I can see you whole and free. I behold the Christ in you. I can see this as you walk. I can see this in all you do. I can see this as you talk. I behold God's love expressed, and I can see you filled with power. I can see you ever blessed. See Christ in you hour by hour. I behold the Christ in you. I can see that perfect one, led by God in all you do. I can see God's work is done. I behold the Christ in you. Amen. Let us stand together for our affirmation.